And then I will spotlight me so you can see a little better what I'm doing. I hope you can see this. These are small flies. I'll do the run through first. This is a popular pattern amongst a lot of these competitive guys now. I'm not sure why, unless maybe it's very effective. They're called Perdigon, and they're basically a nymph pattern. The typical ones that I've seen the guys using are a lot smaller than what I would be tying on today. But I'm tying on a bigger hook today so you can see what's going on. This is one of the smaller ones, so you can see the difference in size. And this smaller size seems to be one that a lot of them tie. However, I'll tie it on a big hook so you can see what it's all about. The hook that I'm going to tie on today, you probably can't get because it's a Partridge, old style Partridge, size 14, but it has the right size for what I want to do. The small ones that I was tying on, I showed you earlier, are these guys here. They're a Firehole, and these ones are a size 12, but that's the gap. You can see how small the hook is. It's really quite small. And you can tie these things down to size 18, apparently. So the first thing is, I'm going to show you the hook with the bead attached. Now on this one, the bead is a 1/8 inch bead. If you get smaller hook sizes, you need to go down to a 3/32 or something like that. And the first thing that goes on here is some lead wire, and that just makes up the bulk and adds a little weight to the front of the hook. And so I'm going to get about 5 turns. And on this hook size, I'm going to use some, I think it's 020. I'll just double check here. It's 020 lead wire. I have this really neat dispenser. I have a whole range of stuff in. That was from Spirit. And I'll start it in the middle of the shank here, and I'll do about 4 or 5 wraps. Of lead wire. And then this is always a tricky bit. You need to get this lead kind of tightly wrapped and pinch it off really close to the shank, because I'm going to be shoving it up inside the bead to hold the bead in place. And then I want the tag end trimmed short, because if I don't get a nice transition between where the lead is and the rest of the lead, the rest of the fly. You get kind of a funny little bump. So I'm going to shove that in behind the hook, behind the bead, and try and get in there pretty good. That little tag is not going to cooperate this morning. There we go. That's a little better. All right. So it's shoved in there, and that helps hold the bead in place. Now the thread I'm going to use is a fire orange, and it's about a 140 or an 8/0 would probably work. And I will start that right behind the lead wire, just so that it holds it in up against the back of the bead. Trim it clear. Just that little bump is still sticking out. I'm going to try and flatten that down. Then I'll wrap through the bead just to make sure that the lead wire is good and solid, covered. And this fly has a very, very thick thorax. So what I'm going to do is do quite a few wraps up here to start thickening out the front end of the fly. And the reason for that is that I want to get a decent transition between the back and the front of the fly. And it's not easy to do if you don't get some bulk up front first. These things are very thick at the front and skinny at the back. Okay, now that I've got that in there, I can reorient the hook in the vise a bit so that, because I had it in the vise with the bead down to keep it up against the eye of the hook. So I'm just going to coat the body of the hook all the way back to roughly where the barb would normally be. This is a barbless hook. And I'm going to attach there the tail. And the tail is this neat stuff that's called Coq de Leon. And what's neat about this stuff is it's got a really fine mottling out here in the tail fibers. And the other reason that this works really well for mayflies and stuff is that the fibers are fairly stiff. They will support a mayfly fairly straightforward on the surface. So it gives a really nice look to the tail of the fly, and it's stiff enough to help if you're tying it dry, tough enough to support it. All I'm going to do is take, I say 6 or 8 strands of this, and I'll pull it out at right angles to the stem. And then I'll just grab the tips and pull it off the stem. That'll keep the tips nice and even. And I measure that. I want the tail to be about what the body length is out the back. So I'm going to tie that in right at the back of the body where I left the thread off. And then I'll wrap forward. And I'm not going to trim it because I'm going to use some of that material up over the bump between the back of the fly and the front of the fly to smooth out that transition. And here I'm going to build that a little bit smoother again. And I'll go back to the tie-in point again for the tail. Now the rib on this is actually stripped peacock herl. And you ask yourself, how do you strip peacock herl? It's pretty fine stuff. So what you do is you take your regular peacock herl, and that's what it looks like, and find yourself a workspace that you can lay it down on the workspace, and you get an eraser and you lay it down flat on the workspace. And you won't be able to see this because the workspace is out of the camera range, but I'll give it a couple of rubs so that you can see what happens. So I just rub that down the stem, holding on to the end with one finger. It takes a couple of minutes to do a few of these. Do them one at a time. So there, that's a few stripes, and you can see how I've taken the fuzz off. And you work at that for a little bit, and you'll get a clean peacock herl stem. So there's the nice clean stem there. And I try to do it at a fair length so that I have enough to work with. And there's a little bit of fuzz left over. So after I get that stripped, I tie the stripped part down on top of the hook. And then I will wrap forward on top of the hook like I did the last time with the other stuff and get it on that transition. And then strip that off the front end. And again, I'll spend a little bit of time here with thread, trying to get that tapered body, really skinny at the back and tapering forward. And there's this transition between where the thread tapers forward and where the lead is. And I want to try and make that relatively smooth, because otherwise the tinsel does not wrap very well over that bump. So I'm going to try and smooth out that bump. You can see it's getting a little better. Okay, now then the body is tinsel, and I've done it in various colors of tinsel. So that's a silver. There's a green, hard to see in the light here. I've done it with red. Here's a red one, and a gold. So you can do it in a variety of colors. The silver one I like because this particular silver tinsel it's a holographic tinsel. It tends to add a really nice glisten to the whole thing. So again, I'll wrap on top of this all the way back to where the tail is. Bring my thread forward. Because I have with this nice little spool keeper that Florin has been so kind to show us how to make, I can stretch that back and put the tinsel in the material clip so it's out of the way. Once again, I'm going to work on the front end of this to try and get that bulk built up right behind the bead so that it's not quite the same diameter, but getting close to the same diameter of the bead, right where it's at where the thread hits the bead. At that point, I'm going to kind of quit thickening the body out. And I will tie a very quick whip finish behind the bead, because if I do it with my fingers, I throw in a half hitch, it never ends up in the right spot. Whereas I can control where it goes with my whip finisher, get that half hitch right behind the bead. Get my bobbin holder, and I'm going to gain just a little adjustment in the way the hook shank is. And then I can take and use my rotary vise to wrap the tinsel up the body of the fly and trying to overlap the tinsel a little bit so I don't end up with any orange in between the wraps. And that's always a little tricky. I knew that was going to happen. This thread is quite slippery, and so the tinsel doesn't want to lay nice and even. There we go. Okay, we'll just do it a little quicker so I'm not pissing around too much. Got to avoid the hook shank, the point. So I'm wrapping this up the whole shank of the fly all the way up over that transition, all the way up till I'm right behind the bead. Now there's a little bit of red showing through. I don't think that's too bad. Two, and then wrap in front. Come on, what happened there? Struggling with this thread today. This particular thread has been a bit of a pain for me for some reason. It's one of these threads that if it unravels on you, it goes flat. It's hard to manage. It's fairly fine, but I can live with it. Okay. And then I take my Peacock Herl, stripped, and I wrap it over, and I try to hit any place where that orange is showing through, and trying to keep the wraps relatively even. And the more tapered this is, the more difficult it is to get a nice even wrap. There we go. I think we got it about there. And tie it off. And trim the peacock. Now you see I've got this little bit of orange, and this is what they call a hot spot. So the orange is going to be completely across there. And at this point, I'm almost done the fly. So I will take my whip finisher and little fingers today. I want to make sure I whip finish behind the bead. There we go. Careful that this last loop gets done behind the bead. There we go. Now the fun begins. I've got some orange showing through where I don't want it. So I take a Sharpie here and I will just touch up the orange with the Sharpie where I don't want it showing through. Because this stuff really glows in UV light. There's a couple of spots here where it's gonna show through. I just touch it with the tip of the Sharpie just to cover up the thread. And there, that's better. So I now have a rib fly. And then I want to coat it. And so I've got this Loon UV set stuff that works really well. Doesn't take much. So I just get a little bit on the back here. And I'll coat it. And damn it, those little, that Peacock Herl did what it always does, is it slides backwards. I gotta coax it back into place. The tinsel is so slippery that that Peacock Herl doesn't want to stay in its place all the time. I think you'd be better off with a different material maybe for the rib. I would be tempted to use black thread. This was in the pattern that I used on the net. So come on. Get a good coating of that. And I want it to get the stuff right over top of that. All that red. And then I'll hit it with the UV. And that will set it up. And you can see how when you do hit it with the UV, that stuff glows pretty good. And the last thing we do is we have a dark head. And the orange thread is supposed to be just a hot spot. So then I take my Sharpie and I will blacken the thread on the top with the Sharpie. And the bead. Takes a bit here to get the Sharpie to stick to that. It's not sticking well to the UV. It hasn't set up right. Let's hit it again. See the YouTube video, it looks a lot easier than this. There we go. Now it's working. Had to get the Sharpie to flow. There we go. So the idea is you want to cover up a good chunk of that red thread because you just want it to be a highlight, not a major portion of the fly. So that's him. That wasn't the prettiest one I've done. And as I say, when you put the UV light on it, you can really see that orange glow. Shines quite brightly. And that's it. It gets trickier as you get smaller.
I've been doing a lot of small promenades, and when I'm putting the coating on, I found that I start by turning the hook upside down, and I put the little drop, and then I actually, because otherwise it's going into the eye and everything for me.
Yeah. So yeah, if you put it, just got to reposition the hook in the vise a little bit so that it goes in the right spot.
Yeah.
But when I first did it, the hook, the drop was back here, and you want the drop up here. But so that's basically what they call a Perdigon nymph, and I played around with them a few times. So I can't say I have ever used them. So I will.
There are simpler chironomids to tie out there. This is, I mean,
Yes.
It's a lot of fun to tie, but it's a bit of work.
Yeah. Well, I thought I'd do something different anyway, so that's it.
Cool. The next flies are gonna be, I don't know, simpler? Maybe. These are Mop Flies. And I was told to go to the dollar store and get the proper mop material, which is, in this case, came from gloves or other implements for car washing. So they have these things on them, these bumpy things, and these are the main ingredient in the fly. Now what I do is I prepare, cut a bunch of them ahead of time. I have orange and chartreuse. And in order to minimize the fluff a little bit, I did burn the ends a little to make my life also a little bit easier when I tie these things on. But that's entirely optional. The other thing I'm doing is I'm trying to use a bit of hot colored thread to match some of the colors on the various combinations that I'm doing. And I'm also making use of some of this blob material or some of this other kind of sparkly chenille with long fibers. So you can try, whatever color combinations are pleasing to your eye. Otherwise, for tying these things, because it's the mop material itself is pretty hard to tie on. You want actually thick thread. So a 3/0 monocord like Danville is ideal. Okay. So put on a big bead on a big hook in one incarnation of this fly. So this is the one that I've been shown. So in this particular case, I'm using a large curved Daiichi. That's a size 6. And the bead is also big. It's a 3/16. And I hesitated using tungsten in this large size because that starts to get a little bit too heavy. And it, unless the current is extremely strong, in which case there wouldn't be fish there, the thing would have absolutely no action in the water. So there you have it. The other ingredient that I'm using here, which was not called for in the recipe I was shown originally, is some tinsel for the body. And this was an outcome of going to the dollar store to buy the mop. And I found this tinsel, which is actually quite nice. It's flattish, but it can also be slipped over the hook shank with a certain amount of care. The problem there is that it does fray a little bit. So you can try to do smaller chironomids with this kind of stuff as well. So I'm just going to use the purple, which for the purposes of this exercise, I respooled. on an empty thread spool with the thread keeper in place. So just attach this to the hook. And in order to get a nice underbody, I just start at the head and go towards the bend of the hook. And then when I wrap the tinsel, I wrap it over itself. So that gives me a little bit of a smoother underbody as a result, and everything looks a little neater. Okay, so there we go. With the tinsel, keep some tension here, make sure it doesn't twist. So it comes out nice and even. Go all the way behind the bead. The issue here is because this is a little bit of an oversized bead, you want to fill the gap here behind the bead, which is quite large. Now I've taken to using some electronics pliers for cutting materials that are not fine thread, and they do work beautifully. So wire, tinsels, anything where you feel that your little scissors that are no longer available to purchase shouldn't be used, you can use that instead. Okay, now I take one of the pieces of pre-paired mop, and essentially I'm just gonna tie this in as a wing. As you can see, it's a fairly simple and straightforward process. And give it a few good turns of thread. And in this particular case, you can see it's quite slippery. So I'm going to secure it as well as I can. And now I discovered that I have a little bit too much of this melted plastic on top. Well, then I'm just gonna take my pliers here and just cut plastic. So what's left is nice and relatively soft, and it does start to fill in that little gap. Now I'm going to wrap back to just leave a little bit of room here for essentially what would be like a little thorax. And what I'm going to do next is I'm just going to add a collar. In this case, I have this polar chenille in fluorescent blue, and it's got very, very long fibers. So this is going to be a funny looking one. You can, if you have something shorter, you can use that. It works just as well. So here I'm going to attach this and give myself room here for 2 or 3 wraps of the flash. And the challenge here, so this is a little bit like wrapping wet fly hackle. You want to sort of fold the hackle, so wet your fingertips a little bit. And you can use either the rotary vise to do this, or just do it by hand like this. So keep pulling back. You don't want too much, you just want 1 or 2 turns of this. Same principle as, you know, wrapping wet partridge or something like that. You know, partridge and orange, or partridge. And in this case, I'm going to do 1 more turn because I have this extra gap, which I just don't like. Okay, it's good enough. I'm happy enough at this point. I secure with the thread. 1, 2. Move the camera, okay. So this is the messy version with these long fibers that are hard to work with. Okay. So then pull everything nice and back. And do a few extra turns here to make sure nothing goes away. And then cut the chenille. There you go. This is one version of the Mop Fly. And now you can simply take this idea and run away with it and do whatever strikes your fancy. You know, whatever color combinations you think would be most effective for the water you're fishing. The other thing you can do here is, if you don't like to have this gap between the bead and the blue fibers, if you don't like to have black here, and you think you want a hot spot, then just take some color thread, and that's a way you can add hot spots to any flies. And the reason I didn't start with the orange thread from the very beginning is the very simple reason that this is a little bit thinner thread and is not as sturdy as the black stuff I was using. And so just adding it at the end allows me to tie with a strong thread and then just put a little bit of accent with this. So there, if you think orange looks better than black here, you've got it. No head cement really necessary, I think. Of course, you can put some if you want. You're far away from the soft materials that would get all mucked up by the head cement. And there's fly. So that's one way to do it. The other way is, if you don't want to go and buy mop, you do have chenille very likely. So I'm going to show you how to do a fly using chenille instead of the mop stuff. So what I'm going to use is a slightly smaller hook this time. This is a size 8, allegedly. I guess it is pretty much a size 8. It's just a standard barbless and a nymph hook. And I'm going to use, I think I tied a week ago or 2 weeks ago, I did tie on these hooks again as well. So this time I'm going to use just a slightly smaller bead, like a 5/32 instead of a 3/16. And put the bead on. Okay. There we go. This is also a slightly curved hook. It's not perfectly straight. Okay. Now I want to do it with pink. And this time I have more regular materials. So I think I'm going to get by with using the finer thread. So this is a Danville 6/0, but as I said earlier, size-wise, this is really more like a Uni 8/0. I'm going to use the same thing for the body, which is that purple tinsel, if I can still find it on my desk. There we are. Purple tinsel. And it's frayed here at the end. I want to catch these fibers as well as I can. I go one more time over it so it's nice and flat on the body. There we go. Wrap the body. Okay. Secure it here behind the bead. And cut tinsel. There we go. Okay, now I want to put in that mop stuff. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to try to furl a piece of chenille. So what I'm gonna do, it looks like this. I'm going to secure this. Whoops, bad. Fuzz came off the core of the chenille, so I need to go back and reattach this properly. As you can see here, We've got a bit of a mess. I'm gonna cut it fresh, strip a little bit so you can see here the core is exposed. I'm going to attach properly by the core of the chenille. And the issue here that you need to pay attention with chenille in general is if you don't secure the core, then you basically tie in the chenille by the fuzz. It's just gonna come out. All right, so what I wanna do now is basically decide on the length of my wing. So let's say about this long, okay? Gonna get my rotary hackle pliers here and grab the chenille. And I'm going to start twisting it. Okay, and I'm going to twist it, keeping, so you could probably just, you know, cut a piece here. I'm just keeping it on the spool, but it doesn't really matter. So keep twisting this chenille until the point you feel that it can take no more. And then basically close the loop here, hold it with your fingers and let go of the stuff you've been furling. And that is going to furl nicely into a tight, thicker bit of chenille, right? So you can do this, you know, or not, depending on how thick the chenille you have. I mean, effectively what that mop stuff is just like oversized chenille. Okay. So now I've secured this, and I'm going to cut off the remaining chenille. Okay, now to finish this off in style, I'm going to use a different kind of sparkle. So this is a Herl Palmer chenille. Sometimes you find the same thing called polar chenille. I think the only difference is in the length of these fibers. The stuff that's sold as polar chenille tends to have longer fibers. Then attach this here behind the bead by the cord. Secure properly and move the thread behind the bead. And sometimes what happens is the bead gets pushed in one direction and gets kind of stuck in that position, and you want to wiggle it and make sure that it's kind of centered on the hook shank. And same thing as before. What I do is because this stuff is virtually impossible to put on a spool, I just keep it in the Ziploc bag like this and close it. And then I can just hold it without cutting. So I can, again, get my fingers a little bit wet. So I can fold this like just like a regular piece of hackle, basically. Fibers that don't want to go where you want them to go, just pull back a little bit and try again. Whatever you feel more comfortable with. Here, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to avoid having fibers sticking forward. Okay, so pull nicely on this, secure it with a thread. Great, the thread. So I'm gonna have to see how this can be salvaged in the middle of the fly. So first thing is, don't panic. Your fly is not going anywhere. It's in the vise. Okay. It's not like you have a fish at the end of it. And rethread this. Just gonna continue from where I stopped here. Fortunately, this thing is pretty much done. So I'm going to take broken thread. And I'm going to start wrapping right over it. It's a little bit tricky because I still have the full chenille here in my way. Okay. This is, like I said, there was a reason why I was tying with the other thread, because this is pretty fine stuff and not the strongest thread that I found for tying. Unfortunately, not many manufacturers make these beautiful colors. As you can see, I'm starting to develop a little bit of a mess here. So again, go back. I'm going to try to be a bit more gentle this time. Okay. That should do it. So first, cut all these thread tags. Then move the chenille and pull all the fibers back. And then cover up, gap there nicely. Once you're satisfied with that, just cut the chenille off. And it's time for the whip finish. Again, this being a little bit finer thread, you need a few more wraps here to fill in, depending on how tightly you came up against that bead. Okay, whip finisher. Once twice, cut. Then I discovered that I do have a little bit of thread left there, which bugs me in principle. So I'm just going to try to see if I can get rid of it. So tweezers. Okay, this is a problem, it looks like. It's one of the pieces of thread that was there that I was trying to okay, it's on my side. You don't see what I'm doing. I'm just cleaning this up. When it's a little bit of pink fuzz, I guess it won't create any major problems, but it just does not look good. It's as if you didn't cut your thread right. Okay, well, that should be good enough. A couple of fibers here sticking up front, which are ugly. Okay, well, this is a little closer to perfection. So here you've got another color combination that's mostly in shades of pink. Okay, so that's another possibility. And for the final possibility, if you guys still have the patience to watch, we can do a proper monster with legs. So this one I thought ought to be a decent lake fly. And the chartreuse orange combination is kind of a known one to work. And there's a school of thought there that you can never go wrong with legs on a fly. So let's try to do one of those kinds of
Florin, have you tried to have you fished this pattern?
Not yet. I've been shown it by people who swear by Mop Flies for stream fishing and apparently for lake fishing as well. And frankly, the deviation that I'm going to show you now, it's, you know, can look like anything else that you may be tying in the shape of a woolly bugger or something. It's just using different materials, really. So to me, what I'm tying now, is in many ways resemblant of a woolly bugger kind of creature, right? So you can do this same thing using other materials. I think the only idea here is that this mop stuff is supposed to wiggle enticingly in the water. So I'm thinking that between the movement of the mop and the movement of the legs, you got a lot of action, you know, and that blob frits acting as a bit of a hackle substitute. I've tied a few with orange hackle. I have some orange dyed grizzly hackle, but honestly, it felt a little bit too subdued and restrained. I think once you go to this chartreuse and pink and whatever, you may as well just kind of go crazy, because you know, the point of this fly is not to show restraint. So here I'm gonna try to do this. Maybe if I smash this with the pliers, let's see what happens. Yeah, it's better. So what I did is I melted the plastic here at the end a little bit, and then I want to trim it into some shape that makes it a little easier to tie on the hook, close to the bead, nice and secure. Okay, something like this. So here's the mop bit. And then I put on, so I'm gonna put some frits for a collar, but then I want to put the legs first. And you will see that the collar actually helps to push the legs back nicely into position. So what I'm doing here is these are the finest rubber legs that I could find, and I don't know if they're still available or not, but there's something out there called silly legs. I think they're still available. And I picked this particular color because it seemed to me to be a good color match for what I was doing. But you know, taste may differ. You choose whatever you have or whatever color you like. So I don't know. This is supposed to untangle, no? Okay, I did get it untangled. All right. So what I did is I took two legs. So two of these pieces of stretchy plastic, silicone, whatever it is. It's very soft and very flexible. Okay, so I'm folding it. So now I have 4 strands. I'm cutting it again in half. So now I have 4 strands that I'm going to tie on the hook. So what I do is I grab them in the middle as well as I can estimate and just slide the whole bunch under the thread like so, okay? And I judge this to be about the halfway point. Secure with 1 wrap, 4 on one side, and then pull the other 4 to the other side and secure with another wrap or 2. And then pull the whole lot of them back and do a few wraps of thread right where you tie them in, right there. So right now they're still kind of hanging all over the place. And the way we're going to remedy that is by adding a little collar here of this. I just happen to have this bicolor frits. Okay, so in this case, if you don't have this one, anything, I'm aiming for a combination of orange and chartreuse here. So if you have orange blob, that would do just as well. Okay, so try to keep, now the only thing is you want to keep the legs kind of divided, right? So 4 on one side and 4 on the other side. And you want to attach your, how many fibers here? Okay, attach your threads. Make sure that the core gets caught by your thread. Okay, and here the bead, let's see, is it well centered? Yeah. Okay. So now move the thread forward to behind, right behind the bead. And let it hang. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm just going to wrap this as a little hot collar. So pull the fibers back. And nice and tight here against the rubber legs, because this is going to help keep the rubber legs flowing back nicely. And by the way, you know, since we're on the topic of carp flies, last, was it a week ago or 2 weeks ago? This would be something worth trying for that purpose. You know, it doesn't resemble anything in particular, but it just has colors that might, I get some of this fish thinking about, okay, well, I think 2 wraps is all I'm gonna get here. Make sure that it's all around. Yeah, it's all around. So we'll keep the fibers pulled back. Make sure that I try to trap as few as possible here when I secure the threads. So there we go. I think 3 wraps should do it. And then pull everything back and do a few more here right behind the bead. It's hard to see exactly what you're doing because this stuff is very violently colored, and then the colors and the light and everything reflects in the bead, and it's hard to tell where the bead ends and where the rest of the thing begins almost. And now this is going to break the brightness a little bit here. Okay. So time for a whip finish. One, 3. And one final whip finish. This will do. 2, 3. Okay. Cut. And then just double check that here these rubber legs are reasonably even at the back, and they look like they are, so no further trimming is necessary. So I haven't tried this fly, but it looks good to me to try as an all-purpose lake search pattern. You know, it's got vial colors, it's got legs that move, it's got a bead which is not too heavy because it's brass. You can fish this on a sinking line as well. And chartreuse is supposed to be good for water that's not that clear. So if you're fishing a turnover in a clear lake, or you're fishing in something like elk, which I guess even after the water quality starts improving, there's still going to be a little bit murky. Yeah, it should be visible. And in a stream, I don't know. I guess this is a chum color, right?
Yeah, probably.
So
I would, if you want the rubber legs, I know that Robison carries them. They carry them in a couple of different diameters, they have micro ones and regular ones in a few colors. They're on one of the roundabouts in the middle of the store. So if you're looking for silly legs, they're there.
yeah, I would say get the smallest ones, because if you tie a bigger fly, you can put more of them.
Yeah.
And the finer ones you can also use on a smaller fly. But I find that when you go down in sizes with rubber legs, as your flies get smaller, the length to the diameter of the leg starts to get into a range where they're behaving like very stiff. And it's like you put telegraph poles on your fly, and they're supposed to be legs that flutter, and they don't. So that's that, and they're easy to tie. I mean, I've done a bunch of them. I can show you here a few.